Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Wrestling with Rusty right here on YouTube and Facebook. And it's not a very good report. I come to you today as been widely reported on the internet by others long before me, because today is the 6th of March, and I think this happened on the 3rd of March. So I'm about 3 days late, but I'd like to give condolences to the Jim Crockett family, as Jim Crockett Jr., the oldest son of the Crockett family, passed away on the 3rd of March or thereabouts from kidney and liver failure. My heart goes out to all the members of the Crockett family, especially my longtime childhood friend, Jackie Crockett, brother of Jimmy Crockett Jr., and Jimmy Crockett Jr., former president of Jim Crockett Promotions and the National Wrestling Alliance. Um, there's a lot that can be found on YouTube about the Crockett family and Jim Crockett Promotions. And there's the shoot interview by RF Video by David Crockett. There's a shoot interview with Jackie and David, I think, from RF Video. There's the Good Old Days Jim Crockett Promotions DVD by highspots.com. And then there is a DVD put out by Greg Price at nwalegends.com. nwalegends.com has Mid-Atlantic Memories. But everybody seems to put in their 2 cents worth about what went wrong with Jim Crockett Promotions back in the day. And I've never done that here. So I would like to do that. And then we'll come back at the end of the video for some final thoughts concerning the death of Jimmy Crockett Jr., former president of Jim Crockett Promotions and the National Wrestling Alliance. Jim Crockett Promotions started out approximately in 1933 and ended in 1988. During that time, they did many things, not just professional wrestling. They did concerts. They did Festival in the Park in Charlotte, North Carolina. They did Harlem Globetrotters basketball, Dick Clark Caravan of Stars. They did ice hockey at one point, I think, and God knows whatever else. All of that was started by Jimmy Crockett Jr.'s father, Mr. Jim Crockett Sr., who passed away on April 1st, 1973. I first met Mr. Crockett Sr. at the Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling shows in the early 70s, probably a few months before he passed away. I did not know him that well. I was a young child, approximately between 3 and 5 years of age at that time. So I only saw him a couple times, and I talked to him, and he was very nice to me. But I don't remember having a long conversation with him, especially since I was only between 3 and 5 years of age. I'm now 52, so I've seen a lot of wrestling and been around a lot of wrestlers since then. Um, Having said that, my cousin Karen introduced me to uh, Mid Atlantic Championship Wrestling, and I think I met a lady named Sandy Brown who was a fan. She would be constituted as a ring rat. And I can't remember whether I met Jackie Crockett, the youngest member of the Crockett family, and former WCW cameraman Jackie Crockett, and brother of Jimmy Crockett Jr. I can't remember if I met Jackie through Sandy Brown or if I met Jackie Crockett through my cousin Karen. So many years have passed, but long story short, somehow I met Jackie Crockett, and Jackie remained a friend from the 1970s all the way to 2007 before he parted ways with me over something stupid that my mom said that was a lie. But I want to state here for the record again, as I've done in past videos, I love you, Jackie Crockett. You are a good man. I miss your friendship, and I hope someday we come back together and be friends again. And my heart goes out to all the rest of the Crockett family who is still alive, which is Jackie Crockett, David Crockett, Francis Crockett, Debbie Ringley, um, and Lisa Moon Crockett, or Lisa Crockett Moon, and any other Crockett that I'm missing. Please forgive me. The Crockett family is quite large, since some of them are married now. But long story short, rest in peace, Jimmy Crockett Jr., former president of Jim Crockett Promotions, NWA, National Wrestling Alliance. But I would like to give my opinion, as everybody's done a DVD and YouTube video on Jim Crockett Promotions and why it failed, and some of the things you've heard before, I suspect. So it'll be a little bit repetitive, not only from me, but from other people, I think. But some of it you haven't heard, um, or some of it you might have missed from the internet. But I lived it. I went to the Charlotte shows in the 70s at what was then called Park Center on Kings Drive in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is now the Grady Cole Center in Charlotte, North Carolina. And then they later moved the shows to the Charlotte Coliseum, which is now Bojangles Coliseum in Charlotte, North Carolina, before the company closed down in 1988 and was sold to Ted Turner and became WCW World Championship Wrestling. And then, of course, WCW was sold to WWE in 2001 after Ted Turner and AOL Time Warner merged. And the folks at Time Warner did not want wrestling on the TNT networks anymore. And some bad financial decisions made by Turner management led to Vince McMahon eventually buying WCW and burying it. But this video is not about that. This video is about Jim Crockett Jr. and the Crockett family legacy in wrestling. Jim Crockett Promotions started in 1933 promoting various things with Mr. Crockett Sr., the father, who had a wife, Mrs. Elizabeth Crockett, who I met, that was just a wonderful lady as well. But she has since passed on as well. But long story short, they promoted various things, as I said. But their main claim to fame or notoriety to fame was from professional wrestling and minor league baseball. The minor league baseball team was the former Charlotte Orioles, who later became the Charlotte O's of the Southern League of the in Charlotte, North Carolina, and the Carolinas Double-A baseball team at the time. And then now that same team is called the Charlotte Knights in Charlotte, North Carolina, and they're Triple-A, but they are no longer owned by the Crockett's. Having said all of that, let's get back to the wrestling. So they promoted wrestling for a long time, and it really took its stride in the 60s in the Carolinas, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, parts of Tennessee, an occasional spot show in Canada, and then hit its stride in the 70s, mainly as a tag team territory. And Ole Anderson was the booker at one point. Later, Ole went to John Ringley, as Ole was also booking for Georgia Championship Wrestling down in Georgia, which was owned by a different group at the time, and found it to be too much to book both the Crockett territory and the Georgia territory. So Ole suggested to Johnny Ringley, then president of Jim Crockett Promotions, to bring in George Scott Sr. George Scott became was a major fixture in Mid-Atlantic Wrestling, as George and Sandy Scott brother team from Canada was a tag team and were very successful. Sandy Scott went on to work in the office of Jim Crockett Promotions, as well as Jim Cornette's Smoky Mountain Wrestling after the Crockett sold out to Ted Turner many years ago. George Scott Sr. went on to work for the Crockett's in the 70s and so forth. And then at the end of the 70s was let go by Jim Crockett Jr. as booker. And then George Scott went on to World Class Championship Wrestling in Texas with the Von Erichs before landing in the WWF with Vince McMahon to help Vince McMahon create stuff like WrestleMania and many other things, including Saturday night's main event on NBC. But anyway, about the Crockett's, they had stars like Blackjack Mulligan, Paul Jones, Ricky Steamboat, Jay Youngblood, Magnum TA, Paul Jones, Abdullah the Butcher, Rick Rude, Manny Fernandez, George and Sandy Scott, George Becker, Johnny Weaver, Don Kernodle, Wally Kernodle, Tiger Conway Jr., Rufus R. Jones, Johnny Valentine, Greg Valentine, Ray Stevens, Jimmy Snuka, Gene Anderson, Ole Anderson, Lars Anderson, Ken Patera, Mass Superstar Bill Eadie, Jim Cornette, the Midnight Express, the Rock and Roll Express, Baron von Raschke, Pistol Pez Watley, Jimmy Boogie Woogie Man Valiant, Hector Guerrero is Lasertron, um, many other stars in the 70s and 80s. The Royal Kangaroos, Rip Hawk and Sweet Hansen, Gary Hart, um, Sir Oliver Humperdinck, Michael Hayes, Jimmy Garvin, the Fabulous Freebirds, Kamala, Magnum TA, Dusty Rhodes, Nikita Koloff, my buddy Ivan Koloff, rest in peace, Uncle Ivan, and many other stars, Blackjack Mulligan, Bob Bruggers, Mr. Wrestling Tim Woods, uh, just on and on. The level of talent is too long for me to remember or to admit to here. Google it. Having said that, fast forward, Jim Crockett Promotions had a chance in 1985 to buy the Georgia time slot on WTBS from Vince McMahon after Vince McMahon had bought it in 84. Vince McMahon and Ted Turner did not get along. So Jim Barnett, a close associate of Ted Turner, and wrestling promoter Jim Barnett brokered the deal to sell the time slot to to Jimmy Crockett. The time slot was originally to go to Cowboy Bill Watts, but I'm not sure what fell out there. But somehow it did not go to Bill Watts. It went to Jim Crockett. The Crockett family paid Vince McMahon $1 million. Vince McMahon used that $1 million to finance the first WrestleMania #1 in New York, I believe it was, in 1985. And everybody talks about WrestleMania this and WrestleMania that and this and that. But the first big major show for professional wrestling was on Thanksgiving night, November 1983, Starrcade 83, A Flair for the Gold in Greensboro, North Carolina. I was at one of the closed circuit locations in the Charlotte Coliseum in Charlotte, North Carolina. They had the main card in Greensboro, North Carolina, but there were various closed circuit locations around the country. Many great matches. Google search that on YouTube. Go find that card on the WWE Network. You can find most of it also on YouTube. You can buy DVDs of Starrcade 83 at various wrestling sites. But Jim Crockett Jr. and Dusty Rhodes were the architects of the very first Starrcade. It wasn't Vince McMahon with WrestleMania. It's just because Vince McMahon is still in business and Crockett is out of business that the WWE has more name recognition and gets to sort of rewrite wrestling history. But Vince McMahon didn't come up with the first big show. Jimmy Crockett Jr. and his booker, Virgil Riley Runnels, a.k.a. Dusty Rhodes, did. So, having said that, in 1985, after Vince McMahon and Ted Turner fell out with each other, Jimmy Crockett paid Vince McMahon $1 million for the time slot on WTBS, which expanded the Crockett's wrestling territory, as I said, from the old Mid-Atlantic territory, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, parts of Tennessee, and occasionally up in Canada, to all over the United States, basically. And that eventually whittled down to two main competitors, Jim Crockett Jr. and family in the NWA, mainly operating in the southern part of the country, but not always. And then Vince McMahon of the WWF, later to become the WWE. And whatever territories that Vince McMahon did not buy, Jim Crockett bought the rest of them, as he said many years ago in an interview, primarily to use those other territories as ad sales and ad revenue and to secure other talent, not realizing that he had not put into place proper people to run the ad revenue and things like that. Because when you expand nationally, as Crockett did eventually in 85, it's a lot different than when you're doing North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia on a nightly basis, just in the mid-Atlantic states. So he still had an office in Charlotte at 421 Briarbend Drive, Charlotte 28209. But he did not have the proper people to run the national promotion. And when I don't mean talent, his talent was just as good, if not better, than Vince McMahon's talent in ring. When I say talent, I mean the proper syndicator people, the proper production people, the proper production studios, like Vince McMahon did, the sales team that Vince McMahon did, the marketing team. For instance, there was Four Horsemen vitamins, Four Horsemen t-shirts, and Four Horsemen jackets, but Vince McMahon stole away wrestlers, not with just their normal payoffs and bigger contracts, but also with action figures slash wrestling dolls and ice cream bars and all that. And to us, mid-Atlantic NWA people, we thought that was stupid because we just wanted wrestling and people to beat the crap out of one another, which is what Jim Crockett Jr. and the Crockett family had. Realistic, honest pro wrestling that is lacking in most of today's pro wrestling. The only where you can see that is some in New Japan Pro Wrestling and some in SWE Fury, which is a newer promotion that's on YouTube and throughout the country in syndication right now in 2021. But long story short, so it became a two-party race between Jim Crockett Jr. and the Crockett family and Vince McMahon. Vince McMahon did a lot of dirty tricks, including trying to get Harley Race to cancel out and not show up for the 1983 Starrcade pay-per-view, as the main event was Ric Flair, a Flair for the Gold, against then NWA champion Harley Race. And Vince McMahon paid Harley not to show up, but Harley, being a man of his word, showed up anyway, told Vince McMahon he could not do that to Jimmy Crockett. They had the main event, and Ric Flair won his second NWA World Championship inside a steel cage in Greensboro, North Carolina, and on closed circuit TV that I mentioned. And then later in 85, when Crockett bought the time slot for WTBS from Vince McMahon, that's when the company went national and they started to compete with Vince McMahon. And every territory that Vince McMahon did not buy up, Jim Crockett bought up, such as NWA Florida, which was Championship Wrestling from Florida. He bought up NWA Central States, which was out in Kansas City, even though that was a bad move. More on that later. And he bought up the UWF, which was the former Mid-South Wrestling by Cowboy Bill Watts. Bill Watts had expanded it from Mid-South Wrestling to the UWF, Universal Wrestling Federation, before it was sold to Jim Crockett in 1987. So between the years of 85 and 87, Jim Crockett Jr. and the Crockett family went from a regional, small-time, 3 towns a night driving distance professional wrestling company to a nationwide wrestling company that went nationwide and sometimes flew on jets that Crockett had bought, which was an added expense that he should not have bought, which caused financial problems later in 1988. And he also should not have bought the Florida territory that was going downhill at the time. Kansas City territory was on its butt at the time. Some of the Charlotte, North Carolina Crockett wrestlers went out there to Kansas City to try to revive that territory, but it was to no avail. The only time Kansas City had a crowd for Jim Crockett Promotions is when the A crew, like Dusty and Ric Flair and the Horsemen and others, went out there to Kansas City and had a show. Then people would show up. But people never showed up for other people like Sam Houston and Warlord and Barbarian and Italian Stallion and various other people that were not basically almost marquee names. So it was clear that the Kansas City territory was a bad move. Florida was a bad move. But I think the biggest nail in the coffin that everybody admits to, from what I've seen from other interviews done by people, as well as what I've heard privately, the biggest nail in Jim Crockett Promotions NWA coffin was between 85 and 87 for a couple different reasons. 85 in the sense that he still had not gone to guaranteed contracts at that point. He did not go to guaranteed contracts until late 87. So he was still paying people off of the house, ticket gates and stuff. And there was always conjecture about, did this guy get paid enough money? And did that guy get paid enough money? And why did that guy get paid more and this guy did not get paid more, and et cetera, and my spot on the card and all this stuff. So that's one positive thing when contracts became into pro wrestling. But prior to contracts becoming into pro wrestling, you basically got paid whatever the promoter wanted to pay you, which sometimes, depending upon the promoter, was a legitimate payoff. And other times they just BS'd you and gave you a little bit of money to keep you quiet while they pocketed the rest of the money. As much as I love the wrestling business, it's a very dirty business, and they're not always honest in most cases. But then comes 1987 when Vince McMahon helps use the cable companies and tells them that if they carry Starrcade 87 from Crockett Promotions, that they won't be able to carry WrestleMania, and he does some other stuff too numerous to mention, and basically sabotages Crockett to the point where they're scrambling and other things to try to make payroll. As you got to understand something, it wasn't just Vince McMahon that helped put the Crockett's out of business. It was the Crockett's who helped the Crockett's be put out of business by buying the what was then UWF / Mid South Wrestling from Bill Watts. I think they owed him $33,000 a month for that particular promotion. And I might be wrong on the figures, but the point is, it was clear that after the Watts purchase of the UWF to Crockett went into effect for Crockett, that was the beginning of the end for Jim Crockett Promotions, NWA, and they risked being bankrupt. And who would have ever thought a family that was important to not only Charlotte, but to the wrestling business as a whole was almost bankrupt. But one of the things was, and I hate to say this, but Jimmy Crockett stayed too long with Dusty. When an active wrestler like Dusty at the time becomes booker, they tend to want to book themselves and put themselves on top. And in the case of Dusty, he did some other things, which I won't get into here, that caused the product to go down, which caused attendance to go down. And in the meantime, the Mid-South purchase went through, which caused more debt to rise. The Florida takeover went through, which caused more debt to rise. But if you just had to pick one thing, even David Crockett, Jimmy Crockett's brother, said it was the Watts purchase, meaning the UWF purchase. So even though Vince McMahon won the war against Jim Crockett Promotions and then later won the war against WCW and AOL Time Warner, for any true wrestling fan who likes hard-hitting pro wrestling, with the exception of SWE Fury of today, 2021, in my opinion, there's not a better wrestling promotion, not even New Japan Pro Wrestling, that also takes it serious these days. But New Japan Pro Wrestling will never be taken seriously as a whole in the United States of America, I don't believe. I hope I'm wrong, but I just don't believe it. And as such, I never got taken seriously till now. So I'm going to go out there and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say that. What I meant was, let me rephrase that. I took the wrestling business seriously. That's what I meant to say. And many other wrestling fans in Charlotte and in other southern states like the hard-hitting Jim Crockett Promotions style of wrestling, while Vince McMahon was doing the very cartoonish, say your prayers and eat your vitamins kind of thing. And the Rock and Wrestling Connection, not the Rock as in Rocky Johnson or the Rock as in Dwayne Johnson, but the Rock and Wrestling with Cyndi Lauper and all of that stuff. While down in the NWA and Crockett Promotions, they were doing realistic pro wrestling that we need to get back to make the business serious again. I know you can't pretend that wrestling is not real anymore, but you also don't have to slap us in the face with the fact that it's not real anymore. And I have a feeling that if the Crockett's were still in business, we would have a realistic presentation of professional wrestling and not all of the phony stuff that we have to see and hear today as it relates to professional wrestling. So moving on with my story so I can wrap this up, we're at about the 30-minute mark. In 1988, Crockett began to have financial troubles. They were running around, couldn't meet payroll and stuff. So Jim Barnett, the same Jim Barnett that brokered the deal to sell the WTBS time slot from Vince McMahon to Jimmy Crockett, brokered this deal in which he had Jim Crockett Promotions sale to Turner Broadcasting, because we always thought that Ted Turner was always going to be head of the Superstation. And Ted will tell you, even in interviews to this day, that what built the Superstation was Atlanta Braves baseball that Ted Turner owned, and also professional wrestling. So he loved pro wrestling, Ted Turner did, and he loved Jim Crockett Promotions style of pro wrestling. So in '88, he bought out Jim Crockett, and it became WCW, World Championship Wrestling. And the Crockett, most of the Crockett family had a consulting deal in which they worked for the company. For Jimmy Crockett, only worked there a short time. Francis Crockett worked there for a short time. But David and Jackie, David was vice president of TV productions, and Jackie was like lead cameraman for Jim Crockett Promotions. But then later on, WCW, when it was sold and became Ted Turner's World Championship Wrestling. So as you can see from all this rambling I've done for 31 minutes and change, the Crockett family legacy in professional wrestling is and always will run deep. The only person to do it better than the Crockett's, you got to give the devil his due, has been Vince McMahon in the WWE. And second in line would be Jim Crockett Jr. and the rest of the Crockett family. So with Jim Crockett Jr.'s kidney failure here in March of 2021, I would like to say not only to the dearly departed Jim Crockett, but to Francis Crockett, to Jackie Crockett, my former friend, and to David Crockett and any other member of the Crockett family that I can't see now. I would like to say, keep God in your prayers and keep praying for Jimmy, and that should give you peace. So that's the way that, I guess what I was trying to say is, when Crockett sold out to Ted Turner in '88 and WCW took over between '88 and '89, WCW had a bunch of failed bookers at that point, which gave Vince McMahon a head start of approximately 6 years before he ever had any more competition. After the sale of Jim Crockett Promotions to Turner, he had like a 6-year cushion before he had more competition at that point from Eric Bischoff and Ted Turner and WCW. So from 1933 to 1988, Jim Crockett Promotions had the best in hard-hitting, realistic style professional wrestling. And if you don't believe me, go look at most of the tapes on the WWE Network. They have the archives. And if you don't want to go to the WWE Network, go to YouTube and type in the I Quit match from Magnum TA and Tully Blanchard, or Starrcade '83, or the Final Conflict with Ricky Steamboat and Jay Youngblood versus Sergeant Slaughter and Don Kernodle. But the point is, no matter what wrestler you speak of, even before some of them worked for Vince McMahon, they worked for Jim Crockett Promotions. Example, before Lex Luger worked for the WWF, there was Lex Luger as a horseman in the NWA Crockett Promotions. Before Tully Blanchard and Arn Anderson went to the WWF as the Brainbusters, they were part of the Four Horsemen in the NWA. Ole Anderson worked for Jim Crockett Promotions, but never went to WWF. Let's see some others that might have went to the WWF. Roddy Piper was on Starrcade 83 and had worked for the Crockett since the 70s before jumping to Vince McMahon in 85, 86, something like that. So there were constant stars that jumped to and from the NWA to the WWF at the time. So, and there was heat between Jim Crockett and Vince McMahon. I'm not sure what that was. And to be honest, when Jimmy Crockett was alive, he was kind of a loner in the sense that he didn't take a lot of people into his confidence. I know Bill Apter of Pro Wrestling Illustrated and now OneWrestling.com is a friend of Jimmy Crockett's. And I know that Ric Flair was a friend of Jimmy Crockett's. And that Dusty Rhodes, Virgil Runnels, was a friend of Jim Crockett. But after that, Jimmy kind of kept to himself with other people. I knew Jimmy myself. He spoke to me and on a couple of occasions, but I didn't know him that well. He always seemed very rude to me, but at the time when he was rude, I was younger and I didn't realize the pressures that one has to be under to run a multi-million dollar company. The way that Jim Crockett was under the gun, not only running the multi-million dollar company that had expanded, but also fighting off the evil empire / competitor of Vince McMahon and the WWF, which later became the WWE. So, and then after the sale of Jim Crockett Promotions to Ted Turner, Jackie Crockett went on to be WCW cameraman, and David Crockett went on to be vice president of production. Jimmy Crockett went on to have an ice cream store and sell some used cars, and also try to get back into wrestling at one point with a new company, but that didn't work out. But the Crockett family and the Crockett family legacy and Jim Crockett Jr. specifically will be remembered, and also Jim Crockett Sr. will be remembered all the way back with history and lineage from 1933 to 1988. That's 55 years of promoting wrestling in this country, pro wrestling. So without the Crockett's, there would be no WCW, no NWA, no WWF even, I don't think. So while Vince McMahon gets more notoriety because his company won the wrestling war with the Crockett's and then later won the wrestling war again with Ted Turner's WCW when Vince McMahon bought out Ted Turner's WCW in 2001. I think the legacy of Jim Crockett Promotions will be the only wrestling promotions company that was willing to take on Vince McMahon and try to compete on a national level and try to win. And I also think Jim Crockett Promotions legacy, which was run by Jimmy Crockett Jr. and David Crockett mostly at the time, their legacy will be not only did they take on Vince McMahon nationally, but they also had hard-hitting, realistic style pro wrestling that most of us grew up on and that we're longing for today as I sit here March 6, 2021. So let me say, I will never forget not only Jimmy Crockett Jr., even though we didn't always get along, I will never forget the Crockett family, specifically Jackie Crockett, my old childhood friend. I will never forget the NWA and the Crockett Promotions matches, or the new NWA that I watch now with Billy Corgan. I'll never forget WCW, but there would be no WCW if there was not no Jim Crockett Promotions. So Jim Crockett Promotions should be commended that even though they eventually lost the war to the WWF and Vince McMahon, at least they had the guts to try to take on Vince McMahon and Hulkamania in the 80s before losing that war to Vince McMahon. and then the company later becoming WCW and then shutting down completely in 2001. So I have fond memories of most of the Crockett's. I miss Mid Atlantic Championship Wrestling. I miss the Crockett Management NWA. I miss going to the matches in Charlotte. I miss the Mid Atlantic Championship Wrestling TV shows. I miss the WCW World Championship Wrestling TV shows, 605 Saturday night on WTBS that Jimmy Crockett had, followed by the WCW shows later on TBS and TNT when Ted Turner took over. But none of that would have been possible had it not been for Jimmy Crockett Jr. And then prior to that, his dad, Jim Crockett Sr. So while the Crockett's have to bear responsibility for their company basically almost going bankrupt and having to sell the company to Ted Turner, look at all they accomplished prior to 1988 before they had to sell the company to Ted Turner. So not only are they great pioneers in professional wrestling, but they should be commended for everything that they've done, past and present, for the world of professional wrestling. They also were very involved in the ARC, Association for Retarded Citizens, in the Charlotte, Mecklenburg County, North Carolina area. So I thank them for that as well. And so even though they failed and lost to Vince McMahon, they really didn't fail. The Crockett family has nothing to hang their head about. They had a wrestling company and baseball company and other promotions company that worked well for approximately 55 years before the end. So my heart goes out to the Crockett family. I will have fond memories of my days in and around the Crockett's and the wrestlers of Jim Crockett Promotions. I didn't always get along with every Crockett that I met, but I respected every Crockett. I didn't always get along with Jimmy Crockett, but I still respected him. So rest in peace, Jim Crockett Jr., former president of Jim Crockett Promotions. And my thoughts and prayers are with the friends and family of Jim Crockett Jr., past, present, and future, as they go through this difficult time on the death from liver and kidney failure of Jim Crockett Jr., former president of Jim Crockett Promotions. Rest in peace, Jimmy Jr. Go sit high on that mountain and start promoting wrestling in heaven, my brother. You'll be gone, but your family's legacy in professional wrestling will never be forgotten by me or any wrestler that worked for you or any true pro wrestling fan that likes something besides the WWF/WWE and the cartoon, unrealistic pro wrestling that we get today. We thank you for the realistic pro wrestling that you brought to us and that your family brought to us from 1933 to 1988. And we will never forget you or your family adulthood that we had with Jim Crockett Promotions, Mid Atlantic Championship Wrestling, World Championship Wrestling, and the National Wrestling Alliance. Again, condolences to the rest of the living members of the Crockett family on the death and the loss of your family member, Jim Crockett Jr., former president of Jim Crockett Promotions. Repeating again, former president of Jim Crockett Promotions and the National Wrestling Alliance, Jimmy Crockett Jr., dies of liver and kidney failure at the age of 76. Rest in peace, Jim Crockett Jr., and condolences to the Crockett family. Continue to keep Abe Jacobs in your prayers, former Jim Crockett Promotions wrestler. Abe is getting better somewhat, but he's still got a long way to go. Abe is getting better somewhat, but he's still got a long way to go. He's 92, I believe. So keep Abe in your prayers. Keep the Crockett family in your prayers with the loss of Jim Crockett Jr. There's been a lot of deaths in pro wrestling recently. I hope on the next edition of Wrestling with Rusty right here on YouTube and Facebook, I can come back to you and talk about something more important. Or not really more important, because there's nothing more important than death. But I should say more fun and not so depressing as death. And we can get back to talking about wrestling and the sport that we love and what's going on in the world of professional wrestling. So I'm sorry that I had to ramble on for 45 minutes, but I wanted to give my opinion on the legacy of not only Jimmy Crockett Jr., but the legacy of all the Crockett family, the National Wrestling Alliance, World Championship Wrestling, the Ted Turner WCW after the Crockett sellout, and WWE's impact, and how WWE has now turned wrestling into a cartoon joke. And wrestling would be so much better and so much more popular if we still had the Crockett family promoting realistic professional wrestling, not only in the Carolinas, but in the United States of America. I love you, Crockett family. Rest in peace, Jimmy Crockett Jr. And we'll see you next time right here on YouTube and Facebook with Wrestling with Rusty. Take care, everybody, and thanks again for watching. Sorry for rambling. If you got any questions, give me a call at 724-826-0449. That's my cell phone. Or my email is rusty.loudermilk. That's RUSTY .loudermilk. LOUDERMILK is how you spell it. Like speak louder and give me milk. rusty.loudermilk@yahoo.com or 724-826-0449 on the cell phone. Take care, everybody. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time right here on YouTube and Facebook with Wrestling with Rusty. Bye-bye, everybody.